Marissa Johnson walked into the courtroom feeling the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders as she stood before the judge. Her heart pounded in her chest, her palms clammy as she gripped the sides of the chair for support. She knew the odds were stacked against her, and no one in this room would give her the benefit of the doubt. She was a black woman accused of shoplifting, and in a town like this, that was enough to seal her fate. Even before the trial began, she had heard the whispers about Judge Thomas Donovan, how he ruled with an iron fist, how he didn't believe in second chances for people like her, and today she was about to experience it firsthand. The courtroom was quiet save for the rustling of papers and the occasional murmur from the gallery. Marissa felt like a fish in a tank, surrounded by eyes that didn't see her as a person, but as a stereotype, a criminal in the making. Her lawyer, Claire Reynolds, stood beside her, speaking in soft tones to remind her to stay calm. But it was hard to focus on anything other than the man sitting high up on the bench. Judge Donovan was a middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp features. His eyes were cold like ice, and his reputation for being tough on crime preceded him. In fact, he had built his career on being a no-nonsense judge who wasn't afraid to make an example of people like her. As Marissa stood there waiting for the proceedings to begin, she couldn't help but feel the sting of judgment in the air. She had been raised to believe in justice, that the truth would always come out, but in this room it felt like there was no room for truth. Not when her race was the first thing everyone noticed, not when the judge had already made up his mind about who she was and what she was capable of before she had even spoken a word. Judge Donovan finally spoke, his voice cutting through the silence, his eyes never leaving Marissa. As he addressed the courtroom, his tone was condescending as he began to explain the charges against her as though he were already certain of her guilt. Every word he said seemed to weigh heavier on Marissa's chest, as if each accusation was a blow to her dignity. He didn't even bother to look at her lawyer. As Claire began to present the defense she had carefully prepared, the judge didn't seem to care about the facts or the evidence that Marissa had been wrongly accused. All he saw was a black woman in front of him, and to him that was all the information he needed to make a decision. Marissa tried to keep her composure, but it was hard. Her mind raced with thoughts of her two young children waiting at home. She thought about the life she had worked so hard to build, a life of integrity, a life of giving back to the community, a life that would be destroyed by a single decision from this man who didn't know her at all, who had never bothered to learn who she really was. But she knew she had to fight, she had to stand tall, even if it felt like the whole world was stacked against her, because this moment was bigger than her. It was about something far greater than just one woman's struggle. It was about challenging a system that had already decided her fate before she had even stepped into the courtroom. Judge Donovan's eyes narrowed as he listened to Marissa's defense attorney, Claire Reynolds, present her case. Claire spoke with confidence and clarity, outlining the flaws in the accusation against Marissa and presenting evidence that suggested a misunderstanding and misidentification. Yet every word Claire spoke seemed to fall on deaf ears. The judge didn't even glance at the documents Claire handed him, nor did he acknowledge the facts being laid out before him. His mind was already made up. Marissa felt a wave of frustration rise within her. As she stood beside her attorney, she could see it in Judge Donovan's eyes. The unspoken judgment that he had already decided who she was and what her fate would be. His gaze remained cold and distant as he scanned the room, barely acknowledging the defense's argument. When Claire finished speaking, the judge cleared his throat and began to speak in a slow, deliberate tone that made Marissa's stomach churn. "Miss Johnson," he began with a condescending edge, "it's unfortunate that we're here today in this courtroom over something as trivial as shoplifting, but it's clear that this is not your first brush with trouble." His words felt like an attack, as if he were using the accusation as a means to paint a much broader picture of who she was. He barely paused before continuing, "It's not surprising that someone like you would get involved in such petty crimes." Marissa's pulse quickened and her hands balled into fists at her sides. She could feel the heat rising to her face, but she kept her expression neutral. It wasn't the first time she had encountered prejudice, but it still hurt. It always did. Being assumed guilty before given the chance to explain was something she had experienced her entire life, but never quite like this. Never in a courtroom where her future was on the line. The judge's voice continued, his words sharp as he spoke about the crime and made insinuations about her background and character as if her race was enough to explain everything. He spoke in a way that made it clear he had already deemed her unworthy of empathy or understanding. He made it sound as if people like her were destined for trouble and that the law was merely there to clean up the mess they left behind. He didn't even attempt to mask his biases. Claire leaned in toward Marissa, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Stay calm," she whispered. "We've got this." But even Claire's calm demeanor couldn't mask the growing tension in the room. Claire knew this was bigger than just a shoplifting accusation. It wasn't just about the crime, it was about the system that had already branded Marissa before she'd even spoken. Marissa felt the sting of his words as they pierced through her, but she couldn't let him see her break. She had worked too hard for too long to let someone like him define her. As he continued to talk, she thought about everything she had done to get to this point. The community work she had done, the nonprofit she had founded, the way she had helped countless children find hope where there was none. But in this moment, none of that mattered to Judge Donovan. His mind was closed, his decision was made. In that moment, Marissa made a promise to herself. She would not let this man define her. She would not let him win. Even if the odds were against her, she would fight back. She would show the world that she was more than the assumptions that people like him made about her. She would fight for her dignity, and she would fight for her future. The courtroom felt suffocating as Judge Donovan's gavel came down with a sharp, echoing thud. Marissa's stomach twisted, her heart sinking deep into her chest. The words that followed hung in the air like a thick fog, each one heavier than the last. "I hereby sentence you, Marissa Johnson, to 6 months of community service and 2 years of probation," Judge Donovan announced, his voice cold, devoid of any empathy. "Let this be a lesson that no one is above the law, no matter where they come from." His eyes didn't meet hers as he spoke, and for a brief moment, Marissa wondered if he even saw her at all, if he even cared to see who she was as a person. The courtroom was silent, a collective breath held in disbelief. Marissa could feel her body stiffen, the weight of the sentence pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She had expected it, in a way, expected him to be harsh, to make an example of her. But hearing it aloud, hearing him say it like she was just another criminal, a statistic, it was almost too much to bear. She tried to keep her face composed, but her hands trembled as she clutched the sides of the chair in front of her, fighting to hold back the tears. Her children, sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, didn't fully understand what was happening, but Marissa could see the confusion in their eyes. They didn't know why their mother was being treated like a criminal. They didn't know why their mother, who had worked so hard to make a better life for them, was now being punished for something she hadn't done. Marissa's heart broke for them. They had seen her work long hours, volunteer at local shelters, fundraise for causes that meant something to the community. They had never seen her as anything other than the strong, loving mother who did everything for them. Now, they were witnessing their mother being torn down by a system that seemed intent on making her smaller, less than she was. Claire, standing beside her, looked like she was ready to explode. Her face was flushed with anger, her jaw clenched as she looked at Judge Donovan with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "Your Honor," she said, her voice sharp but controlled, "with all due respect, I believe this sentence is unjust. My client was wrongly accused and has no prior criminal record. This punishment is disproportionate, and we will be appealing." But Judge Donovan barely acknowledged her words. His eyes flickered briefly to Claire, but there was no warmth, no consideration. He didn't care about the facts, not now, not in his mind. Marissa wasn't someone worthy of that kind of respect. She was just another black woman in his courtroom, and to him, that was enough. As Marissa's lawyer gathered their papers, preparing for the next steps, Marissa stayed rooted in place, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew this wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger, something that had been brewing for years, for centuries. It was about the bias that ran so deep in systems of power, systems that were supposed to protect and serve everyone, but too often crushed the most vulnerable underfoot. It was about the stereotype that black women like her were destined for trouble, that they were inherently criminal, unworthy of empathy, unworthy of justice. For a moment, Marissa wondered if she should just give up. if the weight of this injustice was too much to fight against. But then she thought of her children again, and her resolve hardened. She couldn't let this stand. She couldn't let them grow up in a world where their mother was judged by the color of her skin and not the content of her character. She had to fight. She would fight for them, for herself, for every black person who had ever been wronged by a system that was supposed to serve them. "I'm not guilty," Marissa whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "And I'm not going to let this define me." But as she left the courtroom, the harsh reality of her sentence set in. The community service, the probation, it would mean lost opportunities, extra struggles, and more time away from her children. The fight had just begun, but already she felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. And yet there was a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of something more powerful than the unfair system she was facing. Determination. She wasn't going to let Judge Donovan, or anyone, break her. Just as the courtroom began to settle into the aftermath of the judge's ruling, something unexpected happened. Claire Reynolds, Marissa's attorney, stood tall and addressed the judge with a quiet but unwavering voice. "Your Honor, I have new evidence," she said, her words cutting through the tense atmosphere like a sudden gust of wind. "Before you finalize this decision, I ask you to consider something you may not have known." The judge barely looked up from his desk, clearly irritated by any interruption to his proceedings. "We've heard enough, Ms. Reynolds. The verdict has been delivered," he replied curtly, not even bothering to glance in her direction. But Claire wasn't deterred. She stepped forward, her tone gaining strength. "No, Your Honor. I respectfully disagree. This is crucial. The woman standing before you, Marissa Johnson, is not who you think she is." Her words hung in the air, drawing the attention of everyone in the courtroom. A murmur rippled through the room, and for the first time, the judge's eyes flickered to her, a brief flash of curiosity crossing his face. Claire paused for a moment before continuing. "You see, Marissa Johnson isn't just another woman from the wrong side of the tracks. She's not just a shoplifter, as you've so easily labeled her. She is the founder of the Bright Futures Initiative, a local nonprofit organization that has been the backbone of our community for the last 5 years. She's worked with countless young people, many of whom are from backgrounds just like hers. Her efforts helped raise millions of dollars to revitalize our town, our courthouse included. This isn't just a case of an accused criminal. This is a woman who has dedicated her life to giving back." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Marissa's breath hitched in her chest as she watched the judge's face transform from a mask of disdain to one of incredulity. For a moment, there was no movement, no sound except the distant hum of the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers as Claire handed over a folder full of documents, news articles, financial statements, photos of Marissa at fundraisers. The evidence was undeniable. The judge's fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses and flipped through the papers Claire had presented. His gaze lingered on the photo of Marissa standing proudly with a group of students from the local high school, all of them smiling, their faces full of hope and promise. He looked back at Marissa, his eyes wide with shock, now registering her differently, seeing her in a new light. Judge Donovan cleared his throat, obviously trying to regain control of the situation. I had no idea," he muttered under his breath, as though he had just realized the enormity of the mistake he had almost made. His usual sharp, authoritative tone wavered. The walls of his prejudices were beginning to crack, but he didn't know how to handle it. The information he had just received was like a punch in the gut, a reminder that his previous assumptions had been entirely wrong. Marissa stood silently, her heart pounding as the room seemed to close in around her. She could feel the weight of the judge's gaze, but it didn't feel like the same cold judgment that had been present earlier. This was different, more confused, more uncertain. He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a criminal, but as a person who had contributed to this community, someone who had worked tirelessly to make it a better place. The thought almost made her breathless. Claire, sensing the shifts, stepped forward once again. "Your Honor, the facts are clear. Marissa Johnson has no criminal record. She is an upstanding citizen who has dedicated herself to improving this town. Her past actions are evidence of her character, not a reason to punish her. This trial was a mistake, and I ask you to reconsider the sentence." Judge Donovan, still visibly shaken by the new information, paused for a long moment. His fingers drummed against the desk, a nervous tick betraying his usual composure. Finally, he exhaled, his voice softer, almost apologetic. I will review this new information and take it into consideration." He didn't seem entirely convinced, but there was no denying the conflict in his eyes now. The prejudice that had been so deeply ingrained in him was being challenged in front of him, and it was a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But Marissa wasn't finished yet. She stood straighter, her gaze unwavering. "Judge Donovan, it's not just about reconsidering my sentence. It's about understanding who I am, who we all are. This town, this courtroom, it's more than just a place where people come to be judged. It's a reflection of the values we hold. I ask you to look at me not as a stereotype, but as a person, someone who has done everything in her power to make this world a better place. We all deserve that, don't we?" Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time that day, there was a flicker of something in Judge Donovan's eyes that wasn't just cold indifference. It was a crack in the armor of his bias, a glimmer of understanding. Whether he was ready to fully confront it or not, Marissa had made her stand. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for something much bigger, for a chance to be seen as she truly was. The silence that followed Marissa's bold declaration hung in the courtroom like a thick fog. Judge Donovan sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Marissa as though he were searching for something within her, some sign, some clue to guide him through this moment. His gavel lay forgotten beside him, a symbol of the authority he had wielded so carelessly before. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone waiting for him to break the silence, to offer a verdict that could change everything. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke, his voice low and measured, though it lacked its previous bite. "I will not make a decision today," he said, his words carrying a weight they hadn't held before. "I will review the new evidence thoroughly, and I will look into the character and history of Miss Johnson, as I should have done from the beginning." He paused, his eyes never leaving Marissa's. "I have made mistakes in this courtroom today, and for that, I apologize." The words hit Marissa like a wave crashing against the shore. Apology. The weight of it was heavy in the air, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage already done. It wasn't enough to erase the sting of being presumed guilty simply because of who she was. But it was a start, a small, hesitant step toward acknowledging the harm that prejudice could cause. Claire stood by her side, her lips pressed together in a tight smile, as if she too recognized the significance of this moment. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she seemed to relax slightly, though she knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Judge Donovan didn't immediately lift his gaze from Marissa. "Miss Johnson," he said quietly, "I will take your case into serious consideration. I will ensure that all facts are presented with fairness and that no assumptions cloud my judgment. You will be notified of my final ruling soon." The words were enough to lift the heavy cloud of uncertainty that had settled over Marissa since the trial began. But there was still an underlying question gnawing her. Was this just a moment of lip service, an attempt to save face after being caught in his own biases? Or was it a genuine attempt to course correct, to learn from the mistake and do better? As the courtroom began to empty, Marissa felt a strange mix of emotions. A part of her was relieved that the judge seemed willing to reconsider her case, but another part of her felt the familiar sting of being unjustly judged in the first place. She had been forced to fight for her innocence, to prove her worth, not because of any crime she had committed, but simply because of the color of her skin and the assumptions people were quick to make about her. The court officer began gathering the papers and clearing the room, signaling that the proceedings were over for the day. Claire turned to Marissa, her expression a blend of pride and concern. "You were incredible in there," she said softly. "You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for all of us. For every person who's ever been unfairly judged." Marissa didn't respond right away. She simply nodded, her thoughts swirling with everything that had just transpired. The judge had apologized. Yes, but was that enough? Would it make a difference in the long run? Would the system change, Or was this a rare fluke? A judge who had been momentarily forced to confront his biases before retreating back into the safety of the system that had supported him all along. She didn't have the answers. Not yet. But as she walked out of the courtroom with Claire, her head held high, Marissa knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, and she wasn't going to back down now. She had already fought too hard to let a single moment of progress be the end of it. This was just the beginning. She would continue to push, continue to challenge the system, because she knew, deep in her heart, that the world could be better. She could be better, and she would make sure the judge and everyone else who had doubted her saw that truth. There was more work to be done, but Marissa felt the first glimmer of hope she had felt in months. She wasn't alone in this fight, and that was enough to fuel her determination for the road ahead. The days following the courtroom drama felt like a blur to Marissa. She spent hours juggling phone calls, messages, and paperwork, much of it relating to the appeal, but also to the whirlwind of media attention that had suddenly surrounded her. Her name was now splashed across local headlines, her face appearing on news reports as the woman who had dared challenge an unjust system. The public's reaction was mixed. Some saw her as a hero, a symbol of resistance against a flawed system, while others still viewed her as an accused criminal, a mistake waiting to happen. But Marissa didn't have time to focus on the opinions of others. She had too much on her plate. There were meetings to attend, people to reassure, and her nonprofit work to continue. The Bright Futures Initiative needed her, and the children and families who had benefited from her efforts couldn't be left in the lurch. Marissa had built something important, a beacon of hope in a community that often felt forgotten, and she wasn't about to let it fall apart just because a judge had tried to define her in a moment of ignorance. Claire had kept in close contact, offering support not only as her lawyer, but also as a friend who understood the weight of what Marissa was going through. The appeal is on track, Claire reassured her during one of their many conversations. I've already sent over the formal request to have the judge reconsider his ruling. We should hear back soon. Marissa appreciated Claire's optimism, but deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about a legal battle. This was about something much bigger. The systemic injustices that shaped her entire life, that shaped the lives of so many like her. Marissa had always known that the legal system wasn't perfect. She had watched friends and family members fall victim to it, their voices silenced, their futures stolen. The assumption of guilt based on skin color was nothing new to her. It was a reality she had learned to navigate from a young age. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just her own future on the line. It was the integrity of the system itself that had come into question. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been underestimated or dismissed simply because of their race. She was fighting for the future of her children, for their chance to grow up in a world where they weren't judged based on the color of their skin. The days turned into weeks, and the wait for Judge Donovan's final decision grew longer. Marissa remained busy, her work with the nonprofit taking up most of her time. But there were quiet moments, too, moments when the weight of it all would settle heavily on her shoulders. She had been so focused on her mission, on proving that she was more than the stereotype Judge Donovan had assigned her, that sometimes she forgot to take a step back and process it all. One evening, as Marissa sat on her porch, watching the sunset, her mind drifted to the people who had helped her get this far. Her parents, who had taught her the value of hard work and kindness. Her children, who had inspired her to keep going even when it felt like the world was against her. And then there was Claire, who had believed in her when everyone else seemed to have turned their backs. It was a quiet moment of reflection, but Marissa knew that the fight wasn't over. She had come a long way, but the final battle was yet to come. Whether Judge Donovan's ruling would ultimately be in her favor or not, Marissa had already won something much more important. She had found her voice. And no matter what happened, she would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged or pushed to the margins. Her phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was Claire. Marissa. Claire's voice came through, tense but hopeful. We've received the judge's final decision. You need to prepare yourself. Marissa's heart skipped a beat, and she stood up, pacing across the porch. "What does it say?" Claire paused for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice firm, but with a hint of disbelief. "The judge has decided to overturn the sentence. The charges are dismissed. He's issued a full apology, and he's agreed to work with the community to better understand systemic bias in the justice system." Marissa stood still, letting the words sink in. Overturned. Dismissed. Apology. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it all finally lifting. After weeks of uncertainty, after everything she had endured, the truth had won. "I knew you could do it," Claire continued, her voice filled with pride. Marissa smiled, tears welling up in her eyes as she thought of everything she had fought for. "We did it," she whispered. "We all did it." The relief that flooded through Marissa's body was almost overwhelming. But even as she tried to soak in the enormity of the victory, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of disbelief. The judge had ruled in her favor. The charges were dismissed. She had not only won her case, but she had also done something more. She had made history. Her fight against a flawed, biased system had worked. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. Claire's voice broke through her reverie. "You're free, Marissa. It's over." The words hit her in a way she wasn't quite ready for. The case had been dragging on for so long that it almost felt surreal to finally have it end. The constant anxiety, the questioning of her every move, the fight against an unjust system, it had all taken its toll. But now it was over, and she could finally exhale. "I can't believe it," Marissa said, her voice hoarse. She sat down slowly, her hands gripping the arms of the chair as if to steady herself. "It feels like I've been holding my breath for so long." Claire's voice softened. I know, but we did it. You did it. And this doesn't just affect you. It changes everything. This case is going to be talked about for a long time." Marissa looked up at the sky, the evening sun casting a golden hue across the horizon. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The years of struggle, the discrimination, the doubt she had faced every time she walked into a room. She had been told time and time again that she was too outspoken, too ambitious for a black woman in a world that wasn't ready for people like her to succeed. But now, as the judge's decision echoed in her mind, she felt an undeniable sense of pride. She wasn't just a survivor of this system. She had outlasted it. Marissa's thoughts turned to her children. They had been the ones who had kept her going through the darkest moments. The thought of them seeing her as a figure of strength, someone who had fought for what was right, filled her with gratitude. She couldn't wait to sit down with them and tell them that the fight was over, that their mother had won, and that they could hold their heads high. "Do you think this is going to change things?" Marissa asked, her mind already turning to the future. "Do you think people will really start to understand what it means to be treated unfairly, just because of the color of your skin?" There was a long pause before Claire answered, her voice thoughtful. "It's a start. It's not going to fix everything overnight, but this case is a symbol. It shows that people can fight back. It shows that the system can be held accountable, even when it's uncomfortable. You've set an example, Marissa, and you've given others the courage to speak up too." Marissa nodded, feeling a quiet sense of responsibility settle over her. She had made a difference, but that was just the beginning. She thought about all the other people who hadn't been given a chance to speak up, the ones who had been forgotten or ignored by the very system that was supposed to protect them. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The next few days were filled with interviews, media appearances, and discussions with community leaders. Marissa was suddenly in the spotlight, her story captivating people far and wide. But despite the attention, her focus remained firmly on her nonprofit and the work she had been doing for years to uplift her community. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, misunderstood, or wrongly accused. She met with a group of local youth, speaking to them about her journey and encouraging them to keep fighting for their rights. "You have a voice," she told them. "You don't have to let anyone tell you who you are. Your future is yours to shape." As Marissa looked around at the young faces, eager and hopeful, she realized that this victory wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been labeled, marginalized, or oppressed. The battle was far from over, but the ground had shifted. There was hope now, and hope was contagious. When Marissa finally sat down with her children that evening, she saw the pride in their eyes. Her daughter wrapped her arms around her, whispering, "I knew you'd win, Mom." "I won," Marissa said softly, a smile breaking across her face. "But we all won." The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Marissa had found her voice, and no one, no judge, no system, could take that away. The days following the ruling were a whirlwind for Marissa, but with each passing moment, the weight of the victory began to settle into her bones. It had taken everything she had, her strength, her resilience, her determination, but she had won, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been unjustly accused, judged by the color of their skin, or overlooked because of the life they led. Despite the outpouring of media attention, Marissa kept her focus on what truly mattered. She was more determined than ever to continue her work with the Bright Futures Initiative which had been at the heart of her life for the last few years. The publicity surrounding her case brought even more recognition to the organization, and with that came new opportunities. Donations surged, more volunteers signed up, and the community rallied around her cause. The town that had once turned a blind eye to the challenges many of its residents faced was now waking up, realizing that there was work to be done, and Marissa was the one leading the charge. But while her nonprofit success felt like a victory in its own right, it wasn't the only thing that was changing. The case, her fight for justice, had set off a ripple effect. Conversations about race and systemic bias had begun to permeate the very fabric of the town's culture. The judge's apology was a start, but it wasn't enough. Marissa knew that. She wasn't content to rest on this singular victory. She knew that true change required continuous effort and action. She worked with local leaders to bring about real reforms, ensuring that every individual, no matter their race or background, would be treated with fairness and dignity in the courtroom. One afternoon, as she sat at her desk surrounded by the hustle of her team working diligently on new community outreach programs, she received a call from the very judge who had once sentenced her. It had been weeks since the trial, and she had been so consumed by the aftereffects of the case that she hadn't expected to hear from him again. "Miss Johnson?" Judge Donovan's voice was hesitant on the other end of the line. "I wanted to reach out personally. I owe you an apology, but I also wanted to thank you." Marissa's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm listening. I've been doing a lot of self-reflection," he continued, "and I wanted to acknowledge that what happened in my courtroom was a grave mistake. I can never undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that I've started to educate myself on the issues of bias and systemic injustice. I've reached out to experts, and I'm planning to lead a series of seminars for other judges and court officials in our district. I can't promise that I'll change everything, but I want to try." Marissa felt a quiet sense of accomplishment stir within her. This wasn't the kind of outcome she had expected from Judge Donovan, but it was the kind she had always hoped for, a true reckoning, a shift in perspective. It was one thing to apologize, but it was another thing entirely to take actionable steps toward meaningful change. "I appreciate your words, Judge Donovan," Marissa replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "But it's not just about you. It's about everyone. The work needs to continue. We've all got a long way to go." The judge was silent for a moment before he spoke again. "I know, and I'm committed to being part of that change." After the call ended, Marissa sat back in her chair and let out a deep breath. It was a reminder that transformation, while slow and difficult, was possible. Even those who had been entrenched in the system could change if given the right motivation and tools. Later that evening, Marissa gathered with her family and friends to celebrate the victory, small and large. Her children played and laughed with their cousins, and Marissa couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle in her chest. She had stood up against a broken system and had won, but she knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. She wasn't going to stop until the system itself was dismantled and rebuilt in a way that truly served justice for all. She was more determined than ever. For her children, for the community, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. and most of all for herself. As the evening sky darkened, the stars shining above, Marissa knew her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. And with every step forward, she would continue to fight for herself, for her family, and for the future she wanted to build. Because in the end, true change wasn't about one person winning a case. It was about all of us fighting for a better world together.